This really is a big day. I was sitting over there overwhelmed a little bit of the day and the moment and thinking through where we've come from and where we're going and where we are. And I'm just so proud right now. I'm proud of this congregation. I'm proud of you, each of you. And there's I'm going to ruin the moment by quoting a line from Jerry Maguire. And there's a line in Jerry Maguire where the lady says about Jerry Maguire, she says, I love him. I love him for the man he wants to be, and I love him for the man he almost is. And that's what I love about you guys, this church. I love you for who you want to be, and I love you for who you are and who you're becoming. And so it's a good day. It's a good day, and I'm going to ruin it by preaching. So, you know, they have this saying and this rumor, this cliche, this stereotype that guys don't follow instructions, right? We just don't follow instructions, and it's completely false for some reason, but it's out there for some reason. Oh, maybe it's not completely false, but maybe just maybe the reason we don't follow instructions is because when we read instructions, we find instructions like this. Here's some examples of instructions that might show us why we don't need to follow. I'll go ahead and show the first one. Add ice for a cold drink. If you've been drinking hot Dr. Pepper all this time, if you didn't know, add ice. Okay, show me another one. Okay, you got this whole long instructions there, and it says, before using read directions, cautions and warnings carefully. If you do not understand or cannot read all directions, cautions and warnings, do not use this product. If you cannot read what you're reading right now, then you probably shouldn't use what you're getting ready to use, okay? Okay. It doesn't make sense. Show us another one. Here's another one. Instructions. Put on food. If you were using ketchup as toothpaste, you're doing it wrong. If you're using it for motor oil, you're doing it wrong. It's meant to be put on food. I guess by this indication, too, if you're squeezing it directly into your mouth, you were doing it wrong. Okay, show us another one. For ease of slice removal, remove cheese from package. So make sure before you eat the cheese at your house that you remove it from the package. Make sure. I think we have one more. Open box before eating pizza. Now, I think that was probably kind of a joke, but that seems like a no-brainer, right? Open the box before eating pizza. Is there one more, or was that it? Go one more. Go to the next one. Okay, there is one more. Oh, this is my favorite. Right here at the very bottom, you can't see it very much, but at the very bottom on the right, it says, to hold the camera in your hand, simply pick it up. So if you're having trouble figuring out how to hold the camera that you own, simply pick it up. Now these are kind of dumb instructions, right? They kind of seem obvious as a first step. And when I was a kid, we would study the Ten Commandments in Sunday school, and I would kind of view Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. Go ahead and go to the next slide here. I think we're ready to go here. This verse here, like those instructions. You shall have no other gods before me. And we'd study it when I was a kid, and I'd be like, okay, good. What's the next one? Got that one. I got that one covered. You shall have no other gods before me. When I was a kid, this seemed like some of those instructions we saw. Okay, open the box before eating the pizza. Gotcha. Have no other gods before me. That makes sense. I'm in Sunday school, God. I think I got this one covered. I'm in church, God. I got this one covered. No issues here. I don't serve any other gods. I don't go to church on Sunday and go to the mosque on Saturday. I don't go to Sunday school on Sunday morning and then go burn incense to an idol on Tuesday afternoon. I just serve God. So I'd read it and say, okay, good. I got that one. What's next? But I've since realized that in certain instructions or processes, the first step is often the most important one. I mean, certainly those things seem obvious, right? That you need to take the pizza out of the box before you eat it, or you need to take the cheese out of the package before you eat it. But I'm going to tell you that if you don't follow that first instruction, it's not going to turn out very well for you. Those are important that you follow that. Here's some other examples about first instructions. The first step of instructions are often the most important. The first turn on a trip. If you turn left on your GPS or if you print out a MapQuest still or whatever the case would be, or if you use an atlas, one of those things that kids need to Google about if they don't know what it is, if you turn left instead of turning right when you're supposed to, that's going to mess up the whole trip. It can mess up the whole thing. I think about the first step in Alcoholics Anonymous. They say, Alcoholics Anonymous say the first step is the most important, and the first step is admit you have a problem. Because if you don't admit you have a problem, everything else is not going to do you any good. Admit you have a problem and you can't do anything about it on your own, or otherwise steps 2 through 12 are not going to be effective. And the reason the first step is so often so important is that the first step is often like buttoning the button on a shirt. I have a button-up shirt today. And I don't know about you, but what I do is I usually start at the bottom and work my way up. You may start at the top and work your way down. If you're a weirdo, that's okay. But I start at the bottom and I work my way up, and what I do is I make sure, because you know the guy's shirt, I'll go ahead and untuck my shirt and be rude, okay? The guy's shirt here, they've got these little extra buttons that I'd never ever use. If I lose a button, I just throw the shirt away, because whatever. And so you've got those extra buttons, so you got to line, if I line that one up, it would mess up my shirt. And so I line up the buttons at the bottom, and then I just make my way to the top. But the problem is, if I mess it up, then I'm going to look strange. That's how first instructions often are. Whenever we button our shirt, we got to do that first step so everything else can line up. And what we will see today is that in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, the first of the 10 commandments, as we study the 10 commandments, is that the first button in regards to our obedience and full life is the most important in regards to God's will. Let's look at that commandment again. It says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Seems pretty straightforward, pretty simple at face value, but there are two words in this passage, in this verse, that we need to take a deep look at. It's the word gods and the word before. Those are two vital words to our understanding and application of this command in our lives. Let's consider that word before first. Let's go with before. Let's talk about that one first. And the word before, it can have a couple of implications. First of all, it can mean priority. Priority. Do you know what I hate? I hate it when people cut in line. Actually, let me rephrase that. I hate it when people cut in line in front of me. I just can't stand that when you're sitting in line. Can you imagine, like if you're at the DMV or you're at, in this really long line to check out at Walmart, where there's like 400,000 customers and only 2 lanes open, and it's like, and to see somebody cut in line, if that doesn't make your blood boil a little bit, then you're not a red-blooded American, okay? That stuff makes us mad when somebody cuts in line in front of us. I also don't like it when I'm at a restaurant and the person that came in clearly late after me gets their food a long time before me. That drives me nuts. What kind of system you got back there? And it should be, as Elaine said in Seinfeld, you should get your food based on who's the hungriest. And so that's me. I want my food. And so, and I absolutely despise it when traffic is merging. I'll often drive from Lumberton to Beaumont, and there's clearly a traffic issue ahead. Traffic stops, and somebody will exit and try to zoom in, and then they'll try to get back in a mile later. Oh, that makes me mad. A story I tell you about that is I was once at Silver Dollar City with my parents. My kids were really little, and we were at Silver Dollar City in Branson, Missouri. It's a theme park, and we were done at the end of the day, and the traffic was just horrendous. And the parking lot was like gridlock. And we finally see there's a guy up there ahead of us, and he's directing traffic. He'd say, okay, now there's 2 lanes coming in. This guy, he'd send 3 cars down this way, and he'd send 4 cars down this way. Then it was weird because he would do a couple cars here and like 4 or 5 cars in this lane. And it was actually doing a good job moving the traffic, but I was wondering, why is he only sending a couple here and then 4 or 5 here? And he kept doing this for 10 minutes, and finally we got up till we were the next in line to come from this lane. And he directs 1 car in from this lane. He walks to the passenger side, opens the door, gets in, and drives off. Now, at first, I was really mad. I was like, this guy just got out of his car, told his wife to drive up, and he was trying to get himself out of the parking lot, but then I was really impressed. That's pretty impressive to do that. And the reason we hate these types of things in our lives is because we feel like we're entitled to the spot we have in line. We got there before you, so we deserve to be in our spot. You don't deserve to just zoom in and get ahead of us. And we may have a point in regards to our society norms in those situations, but when God says to have no gods before him, if we're thinking in terms of priority, then he absolutely has the right to be number 1, doesn't he? He absolutely has the right to have no other gods to come before him in our lives, for him to be at the top of the list in our lives. In verse 5 of Exodus chapter 20, we're going to read it in a few weeks here, but it tells us that God is a jealous God. And no God deserves to be ahead of the true God in any list in our lives. But it's the other understanding of the word before that is actually more accurate to the original Hebrew text. In that case, before means in my presence or in my space. That's really what God is saying in this commandment. You shall have no other gods in my presence or in my space. You see, God has He's put a no competition clause into our relationship with him. In business, a no competition clause ensures that there's no competition, that business is done between the two parties of the contract alone. And so, for example, if a Pizza Hut decides to lease a spot in a strip mall, then they might put a no competition clause into the contract so that the owner of the strip mall won't put a Domino's next to them, because that's going to hurt their business. Or if Pepsi enters into an agreement with a restaurant, they want a clause that Coca-Cola won't be sold in that same restaurant. That's why if you're like me and you have Dr. Pepper, no, Mr. Pibb, give me a tea, Or you got Coke, no, we have Pepsi, that's okay. Or whatever kind of person you are in that situation. Or if Ford buys parts from a manufacturer, a subcontractor, they want a clause that the company's not going to also produce those parts for Chevy at a better price. And the reality is that God doesn't want any competition for our devotion in our worship. He wants no competition. And so if we are signing up to be in a relationship with him, he expects us to not also be in a relationship with another God. God says we should have no other gods in his space. And the reality is that when you are delivered by God, your space is his space. When you were delivered by God, no longer are you only your own, you are God's. And so therefore, your space is his space. It's a little bit like marriage. And it should be no surprise that it's like a marriage covenant. By the way, I'm convinced that God created marriage in part to help us understand what a relationship with him is like. I think that's really one of the main reasons why he did that. But if you look throughout the Bible, you see constant comparison between marriage, the marriage covenant, and God's relationship with his people. You look at the book of Hosea, and you see the whole story of Hosea and the adulterous wife, and really that's a picture of Israel's rebellion against God. You look at we hear in the book of Revelation that the church is called the bride of Christ. But this is how this command in particular is a little like marriage. When I got married, there were several areas of my life that became part of Carrie's life. Things like possessions, legally speaking. We own our things together. And if something happened in our marriage, we would split those things. When we were married and we had kids, and those kids, my kids became her kids. They were our kids. And parenting was not just a decision that I would make, it was something that she would help in as well and be equal in. And of course, the biggie is my sexuality. The reality is that when I got married, that space that was mine beforehand became hers after we entered the covenant of marriage. Now here is why this is important. That all those things that were my space before we got married became her space as well once we got married. Here's why it's important we understand the word before in Exodus as in my space rather than just priority. Let's say that I'm spending my money on another woman. I decide that I want to help, I spend some money on Carrie, but I also want to spend some money, buying diamonds and flowers and all that kind of stuff for another woman. But Carrie finds out about this, but she comes to me and says, wait a second, what's going on? I say, oh, no. I have no other wives before you. I give her 45% and you 55%. How's that going to go over? Or what if I brought another woman in to help parent the kids and I gave that woman, 50 or 45% parental control over our kids? That's not going to go anywhere. And let me say again, what if I started sleeping with other women? But I tell her, it's okay, you're number one in my life. You're still number one. That is just not going to go over well. In every one of those instances, Carrie would be angry that someone was in a part of my life that should be dedicated and influenced only by her. And she would be completely within her rights to demand that I clear that space of other women. In fact, isn't that what we do whenever we make our marriage vows? Forsake all others till death do us part. That's the promise we make. And so it is with God. And so it is with God. When we become delivered by Him, we promise to forsake all others. Remember, the Ten Commandments were not given to people who needed to be saved by God, but it was given to those who were already saved. And when we enter into a covenant of faith with God, He saves us through His Son, Jesus. And as 1 Corinthians 6:20 says, we were bought with a price. Our lives are no longer our own, and that is when our space then becomes God's space. And God says, have no other gods in my space. And do you know what happens when we allow other gods to be in our space, which is God's space? We actually have an example of it in Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2, verse 10 says this. After that whole generation had been gathered up to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook Him and served the Baal and the Ashereths. So what happens when you share your space with other gods? God gets ticked off. It makes Him angry. They aroused the Lord's anger. I mean, you can imagine Carrie would be hurt, but she'd be angry, right? And God's anger is aroused when we allow other gods to be a part of His space. You know, we talk a lot about the love of God. We talk a lot about the grace of God, the mercy of God, and rightly so. Because He is merciful, He is loving, He is graceful, He doesn't give us what we deserve. He gives us so much more and so much better. But let us not forget that sin and rebellion still makes God angry. That's the truth. And when the Israelites, God's delivered and chosen people, forced God to share His space with other gods, His anger burned against them. Church, God is not okay with sharing His space, with sharing what is His with other gods. But let's talk about that word for a moment. Let's talk a little bit about what the word gods means. If you rewind back to the Israelite nation, and you got to consider where they kind of had come from and what had been happening in their lives. And remember, the Ten Commandments were given by God immediately after He delivered the Israelites from Egypt. And for 450 years, the Israelites had been immersed in this culture of Egypt, including their polytheistic religion. Simply put, the Egyptians had a god for everything. They had a god for the Nile. They had a god for the crops. They had a god for the sun and a god for the rain and a god for this and that, a god of the frogs and a god. I mean, really, there were all kinds of gods for everything in their life. In fact, it's likely, as I've said before, that the 10 plagues that God used in the deliverance of Egypt were direct attacks on the gods of Egypt. And so while they had a god of the Nile, God turned the Nile into blood. Where they had God of life, God brought death. Our God brought death. And so you see these different gods were proven as impotent. They were proven as non-existent, as a failure compared to the one and true holy God. And so it's in that context that God commanded that they don't let any other gods into the space that was rightfully His because of what He had done. In this context of polytheism, of hundreds of gods that were part of their culture that they've been used to for so long. And God says, you shall have no other gods before me. But here's a question you need to consider. If God had just systematically dismantled the Egyptian religious system, exposing their gods as frauds and figments of their imagination, while simultaneously revealing Himself as the one true God, then my question is, why did He state it the way He did? Why did God say, you shall have no other gods before me? Because he had just proven to the Israelites that those gods weren't even gods at all. Why didn't he say, I am the only true God, worship me? That seems like to say the same thing, right? That those other gods are worthless, they're not real, so I am the only true God and worship me. Well, the answer comes down to, again, what the word gods means. And as I said earlier, if it simply means some weird deity, then we could have just skipped over this command. Because I'm guessing, as we've talked about before, you probably aren't worshiping another god other than the God we serve today in this room. You don't have a shrine in your room probably to some other god. You don't have a different, we're just not a church of polytheists, okay? That's the reality. And so if all it meant was other gods in that sense, then we could have just skipped over this and gone to the second one. But God said that we should have no other gods in his space because he realized that gods would take many forms in human beings' lives. This is no surprise to you, I'm sure. I like how Tony Evans defines God with a little g. This is what he said. He said, God is anything you look to for good in your life, anything you count on, bank on, or trust in for your well-being. It is the thing you grasp or hold on to make life work. That's what a God is. Now, in Egyptian times, by the way, that meant the little gods that they had over everything. They depended on those things. But for us, it may not be that. It's anything you look to for good in your life, anything you count on, bank on, or trust on in for your well-being, and the thing that you grasp on to make life work. And what happens is we often allow something or someone to creep into our lives and take God's place in our lives. It's often something that God has blessed us with, by the way. It's often something that God has given us to bless us and to give us full life. And what happens is we take the gift and we turn it into the God instead of worshiping the giver. Like the book of Romans says, we turn created things into the gods instead of worshiping the Creator. And maybe it's a person that our happiness and our joy depends on. I've seen that a lot over my years in ministry, where someone is not happy if they don't have that person. In youth ministry, it's I got to have that boyfriend or girlfriend to make me whole. And it doesn't stop when we graduate high school. Sometimes we elevate people to that place. Maybe it's a material thing that we put our trust in. Maybe it's our 401k, our bank account, our house, whatever the case may be. Maybe it's even a principle that we think will make our life work, that, if we just work hard enough that we're going to survive or whatever the case may be. But the reality is that God designed us to have all of our needs to be filled only by Him. And the reality is that if we've been saved by grace, by the grace of God through Christ, then God Himself deserves to have that space to Himself. And that reason, I think you would probably agree, should be enough to not have any other gods in the true space in our lives. And I'm certain that none of what I've said thus far is really anything new to you. You know how we can make things into gods in our lives. And you know that God deserves our space. But there are two other big reasons why we should follow this first commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. The first one is it helps us align everything else in our lives. Like I said before, just like that first button on the shirt is important for the rest, this first commandment is important for our obedience of the other commandments. We're going to be talking a lot about these commandments moving forward, but let me promise you one thing. If you skip over the first one, the other ones are going to be a lot harder. Let me put that in a more positive way. If you follow the first one, the rest of them are a breeze to follow. Think about this. We don't obey the Sabbath. We don't obey the Sabbath because we've convinced ourselves that it's our success, it's our well-being, it's all dependent on our work and in our busyness instead of depending on God. That's why we say to ourselves, I don't have time to rest. I've got so much going on, and if I took an hour out of my day, then that's going to set everything on fire. And God says, well, who are you depending on? Are you depending on yourself, your work, your efforts? You're making a God in that situation. People steal People steal not because they just whatever, but because they think that they need something to survive, or because they have worshiped the god of materialism. That I've got to have that, and since I can't afford it, I'm going to take it. People lie because they think that it's the best way to preserve and advance themselves, and they've made their own reasoning a god in their lives. People covet because they aren't content with the God of the universe and feel that he needs supplementing. People commit adultery because they feel that sex will somehow satisfy or fulfill them, and they've worshiped the god of sexuality. And every one of these commandments that we're going to be studying over the coming weeks, if God was the only person in his space, we wouldn't have to worry about the rest of it. Remember how Jesus summed up the commandments? He said the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and the second is love people as we love ourselves. And then he said, all the law and prophets hang on these commands. You see, if we love God with all of our heart, it puts everything else in place. And that's what we do when we keep God's space in our lives clear of other gods. But another big reason we should follow the first commandment, a scary reason if you ask me, is that our gods will be put to the test. Go back to that passage in Judges for a second. Remember we read that God's chosen and delivered people, Israel. They had begun to share their space that was rightly God's with other false gods. They gave themselves over to the gods of the people that surrounded them, the Baals and the Ashereths. And so we see that happen, and we read that God's anger burned against them, but there was more to the story. Here's the rest of the story. It starts in the verse, right after the verse we read before, in verse 14. And it says, in his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. When Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. You see, it was God that gave them victory and who had led them into the promised land in the first place. That's why whenever Gideon was going to battle, God says, you get rid of those 30,000 men, I want you to break it down to 300. He didn't do that because it was some sound military strategy. He wanted to do that to show them that it was he that was giving them the victory. He told Joshua, I want you to go down to Jericho and I want you to have a parade. That's how I want you to win that battle. And that wasn't because it was some sound military strategy either, because he wanted to show that it was God. It was he that was giving them the victory. And so time after time after time, God was giving the Israelites the victory. It was God who gave them blessings. It was God who gave them freedom. It was God that was responsible for all the victory and good in the Israelites' history. But the Israelites turned their back on God, and they started trusting and worshiping and depending on other gods. And two things happened. First of all, God said, okay, you want to let other gods into my space? Let's just see how that works out for you. If you want to put your faith and trust in a God other than me, then let's just see how they come through for you. Let's see what kind of victory you can get from them. Here's the other thing that happened. The other thing that happened is that by putting themselves on the side of those gods with a little g, they put themselves against God. You read that in that passage before where it said God's hand was against them. God's hand wasn't against them because he was mad at them. God's hand was against them because they had aligned themselves with the enemy. And by the way, when God says to us, okay, let's see how that works out for you, trust in those gods and see if they pay off, that's not harsh. That's not mean. It's actually an act of grace. Because the more we see, as we see in the history of Israelites, they eventually realized that the things, the problems, the struggles they were having could only be fixed by God. And so they turned back to him. And God is gracious when he turns us back, when he shows us that the things that we struggle with, the troubles, the trials, the problems we have, when he reveals to us that no other God with a little g, no other bank account or person or anything this world has to offer can offer us the solutions that we can get. Once we finally realize that, we can finally turn to the one who can fix those problems. Church, remember last week we said that the Ten Commandments were given for our good in order that we can maintain the freedom that God has given? Well, don't be surprised that if you look to something other than God for good in your life, that's going to be exposed as fraud and you're going to be left vastly disappointed. Don't be surprised that thing you count on, bank on, or trust in, if it's something other than God, if you count on that for your well-being, it's going to lead you to failure and you're not going to be well. Don't be surprised that if you grasp or hold on to something, if that thing is not from God, it's something other than God, it will be taken from you and leave you empty. Don't be surprised that if you depend on something other than God, that God will allow that little g God to be tested and exposed in your life. And don't be surprised when letting other gods invade God's space leads to heartache, it leads to struggle, it leads to disorder in our lives. Not because we're being punished, because God wants us to realize that there is only one God worthy to be served in our lives. Only one God that deserves our space. So what should we do? What should we do to make sure we're following this commandment? What should we do to make sure that in our lives we have no other gods before Yahweh? Well, I would suggest that we put ourselves in the place of the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19. Remember the story, rich young ruler? What happened is that a man came to Jesus and he asked what he needed to do to have eternal life. And Jesus said, you should keep the commandments. Actually, he said the 10 commandments is what Jesus was referring to. He said, keep the commandments. And the man was excited because he had done just that. He said, I've done all that, or at least they thought he had. He said, I've done all those. But of course, Jesus could see into his heart and see reality. And despite following the 10 commandments, at least to the best of his ability, thinking he had followed them to a T, Jesus told him he needed to do one more thing. And you remember what it is? Jesus said he needed to go, sell everything he had, and give it to the poor and follow Jesus. And Matthew chapter 19, verse 22 says this, when the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. Now, Jesus wasn't adding a requirement for eternal life. He wasn't even saying that wealth was bad in and of itself. But he knew that for this young man, his wealth was a god that had invaded the presence of God's space. He knew that even though he may not commit adultery, he may not murder, he may not kill, he may remember the Sabbath, he may do all those other things, that there was still that one thing in his life that was in his space that didn't belong. And so to answer that question of what should we do, then I just ask you to do one thing. Put yourself in that man's place. Put yourself in his place. And I want to ask you the question today. What might Jesus, after looking into your heart, say to you? What thing do you see in your life that you might be scared that Jesus might ask you to give up? What is it? What is that one thing in your life that you really hope Jesus doesn't ask you to give up? If Jesus said to sell everything, would it make you sad like it did the rich young man? If Jesus said to quit your job, if Jesus said to fill in the blank, what in your life can you not imagine living without? What in your life is so important, if it was missing, you wouldn't have a life that was worth living as far as your perspective was concerned? When you answer that question, it might just be that a God that you have allowed, it might just be a God that you have allowed to invade the true God's space. But not only must we be honest about the gods in our lives that may be in God's space, but we also have to get rid of them. Identifying them is not enough. We must kick them out. And we do that by replacing them. It's not just a matter of kicking them out, it's by taking that worship. See, we're creatures that were made to worship. You are going to worship. It's just a matter of what the object of your worship is. And we replace the little g with the God that deserves it. We do that by using everything in our lives for God's glory. And of course, we do that by surrendering everything to God. We're going to sing a song. It's going to serve as two things. It's going to be our closing song, and it's also going to be a song of response, because I want you to really consider, what is it? What are we scared that Jesus might say, give this up in your life? What are the gods that have taken place in God's space? Let's pray. God, as we prepare to sing this song, I Surrender All, I pray that we'll sing it with hearts that are true, with intentions that are aligned with yours. God, I pray you'll help us to identify in our lives those things that have become gods, those things that have invaded your space, the things that make you angry, the things that will leave us empty. Allow us to see those things clearly so that we can turn them over to you. We pray this in your name. Amen. Let's stand and let's sing.